Hey, welcome to this tutorial where I'm going to talk about rigging the exhaust nozzles for a jet engine. I have another tutorial, it's much longer, it's like 2.5 hours, where I talk about building the entire afterburner assembly and the petals and all the armature and stuff. So a lot of that tutorial is modeling. It does include the rigging of the petals, but I thought maybe if people were just interested in the rigging, I do a much shorter version of the tutorial where I talk just about the bones and the armature and how to control them. So we're starting with a model that's already built. Every colored piece here is a separate piece. Nothing's parented. Everything's individual pieces. These rings are all assembled. And the goal here is to create an armature and some controls that allow us to open and close the nozzles whenever we need to. So let's start by creating an armature. And I'm going to put my cursor in the middle by hitting Shift-C. I'm going to add a bone, just a single bone. Move it right up here. I'm just going to shrink it down. Kind of put it in here. It's not super important where it is because this is really just going to be the root bone for all the other bones. So I'm going to apply rotation and scale to this. Let me turn this up so you can see everything's applied. And hit F2. We're going to call this petals armature. All right, because these are the petals of the nozzles. And let's go over here and let's do a little housekeeping stuff. Let's turn on names and in front so we can see what the bones are. So I'm going to go to pose mode and I hit F2. I can name this bone. I'll call it root. Maybe not. Petals root. All right, that'll show up as we can now see what that bone is. So the next thing to do is to create some bones to go along these hinges. So let's go back into object mode, and I'm going to just isolate just this one petal here. Go into edit mode. I'm going to put my cursor, I'm going to select this edge right there, cursor to selected, and I'm going to go back, I'm going to go into my, I'm going to select my bone, go into edit mode, and hit Shift-A to add a new bone. It's going to add that bone right at that point where we selected. Let me go over here. I'm going to do the same thing on this side. I'm going to hide this piece. I don't need it. I'm going to select this edge here, cursor to selected, go back to my edit, my armature, my bones, go into edit mode, and with the tip selected, I'm going to hit Shift-S, selection to cursor, and that's going to put my bone right on that hinge line. All right, so let's give this a name. We're going to call this P for petal 1.L for left. Right, we're going to put a suffix of .L on all of the bones on this side so that we can use the symmetrize function to copy all the bones over to the right side so we don't have to duplicate them if we don't. It's extra work we don't need to do. So I'm going to create a reference point here. I'm going to select all these petals and I'm going to put my cursor in the center of those, and I'm just going to add an empty here because we're going to be referring to this point in space with some frequency. This point is the center of all the petals. So with my cursor there in the center, I can go into edit mode and I can hit Shift D to duplicate the bone, right click to cancel the movement, then R45, oops, sorry, got to be in 3D cursor mode, R45, and that's going to move the bone 45 degrees to the right. I can hit F2 and I can change this to P2.L, Shift D, R45, F2, we're going to call this P3.L, and I'm just going to work my way around the engine doing this. This ring of bones now represents the hinges for each of these petals. Now we're going to need another bone to control this piece. This piece moves this way back and forth. So with my cursor still here in the middle, I'm going to select my armature, go into edit mode, Shift-A to create a bone, and I can just rotate this bone 90 degrees and shrink it down just so it's tucked in there. And we'll call this one rods.L, and that'll control these rods. Now we do need additional bones here to connect between, let me hide some of this stuff. Let me go to stick mode, might be easier to see. Yeah, that's better. So we're also going to need bones along these actuators here between this hinge line and this rod back here. Now we can attach the bone to this, but we need something to target the bone to inside this actuator. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, let me hide this for a moment. And I'm going to select just the middle of this guy. I'm going to put my cursor right there and select the armature. I'm going to hit Shift A. I'm sorry, I got to go Tab, Edit Mode. I'm going to Shift A to add a bone. And that's going to put a bone right where our cursor was. And now I can go back to this guy, and as long as the origin is set to geometry, like what it is, you can see the origin's in the middle of that bearing. I can select that, say cursor to select it. It's going to put the cursor in the middle of this bearing. Go back into edit mode, select the tip of this bone, Shift S, selection of cursor, and now this bone runs perfectly from the center of this wheel to the center of this cylinder here. And we can unhide that now. So now we just need to do something similar to what we did with the hinge bones, where we copied them around 45 degrees. So let's go into edit mode, and we'll just name this bone. We'll call it A for arm 1.L. All right, so now we can go into front view, and we're going to use this reference point again. So I'm going to move my cursor back to the center, go back into edit mode, and in 3D cursor mode with my cursor in the middle, I can hit Shift D, bar 45, and that's going to put it right over here. And we can rename it, so A2.L, and all the way around. Next, I want to add some empties to the rigs to give the bones something to point to, and they're going to be along this ring here. So I'm just going to isolate this ring for a minute. And in edit mode, I want to select that ring there, the center of this piece. I'll put my cursor here, and I'm going to create an empty, and just a plain axis empty, and I'm going to scale it down over here under the data properties. Just scale it down. You don't generally want to scale it using scale. It can mess up things. And let's go back here, and now again putting our reference point back here. There we go. In the center, I can take that empty, if I can select it. Oh, there we go. All right, take that empty and rotate it, duplicate it, rotate it 45 degrees. All right, so now we have an empty in the center of each of these actuators, and we want to take these empties, and I want to parent them, or make them children of that ring, so that they all move as a unit. So I'm going to move this guy. I'm going to select all the empties around here. Right, I could have just like select them here, I guess. So there's 8 empties there that are selected, and then I'm going to shift select this ring. I'm going to hit Control P, and I'm going to choose Object. And now if I move this ring, it's going to move all those empties with it. And we need those empties because we need this bone to have something to point to at both ends. On this end, we have this bearing, which we can use as an anchor. But on this end, because we've got all the bones kind of pointing to this ring, we needed something on each end of this bone to anchor it to the various bits. So let's do some parenting now. I'm going to select this petal. Select the petal. I'm going to shift select my armature. I'm going to go into pose mode. Going to select the bone that I want to use as the hinge. Hit Control P as in Papa, and I'm going to choose bone. And that's going to parent this petal to that bone. And we're going to do that all the way around. So select the petal, shift select the armature, go into pose mode, Control P, choose the bone. Now that's done, if we select one of these hinge bones and let's say move it to Euler, and I move it along its y-axis, you can see that the petal moves, which is what we want. But it doesn't move anything else, right? So we need to add a little bit more parenting here. I'm going to take these hinges, these bearings, whatever they are, and then parent them to the petal plate. And we'll just do that all the way around as well. And now we go into pose mode. If we move along the y-axis, that bearing also moves. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to add some keyframes to these bones so that we can pose the nozzles in different positions. So let me open up a couple of more windows here. I want to open up a timeline window, which is this guy. And I want to drag it down again. And now I want to open the dope sheet. And then I want to choose action editor because I want to be in the action editor. You notice that there's no action defined currently. This is empty. We're on frame 1 and we don't have any keyframes assigned yet. So the first thing to do is to assign keyframes at frame 1. And we're going to be moving these on the y-axis. So I want to assign keyframes for each of these hinges at a value of 0 on frame 1. So I'm just going to go around here, click on the bone. I'm in pose mode, by the way, so click on the bone, change it to Euler, and then right click and say insert single keyframe. You'll see it turns yellow. Up here you can see the little yellow diamonds. That means we have a keyframe for this bone. And also up here you'll see that there's this petal armature action name. So Blender created this as soon as we created the first keyframe for our bones. We'll talk about actions later, but just so you know that that was created when the first keyframe was set. So now we've created the initial position for these. Let's set our timeline to 120 frames. It's not super important how long it is, just 120 works pretty well. And I want to move my current time to the end, so I'm just going to hit this end button. It's going to move me to 120. So now we're at the end of the animation at a frame 120. And I'm going to do something similar here. I'm going to rotate this on the y-axis by negative 17 degrees. You can see how that opens up that petal. So I want to put in negative 17, right click, and insert a single keyframe. I'm going to do that all the way around here. Negative 17, right click, insert single keyframe. So now we've got all of our end and beginning keyframe set up, and if we pull our timeline along, you can see that all of our petals now open and close. Let's turn our attention to these actuator arms. What we need to do is we need to attach it to this empty and to this bearing so that when we move the petal, it moves with it. Now the direction of this bone makes a difference. My bones have the thick end up here and the pointy end down here. If your bones are the reversed, you're just going to have to reverse the constraints that I'm about to show you. So just keep that in mind. So go back to stick. So we want to add some constraints, and you want to make sure you use the right constraints. There's object constraints, right? Object constraint, and there are bone constraints. Do not use object constraints. It'll mess you up. It won't work right. You want to be in the bone constraint. You want to be in pose mode, and you want your bone selected. We want to add two constraints. We want to add a child of constraint, and we want to add a stretch to constraint. The child of is going to be for the thick end of the bone. In my case, this end, right? That was the fat end of the bone. And the stretch to constraint is going to be for the pointy end of the bone. And we're going to have the pointy end of the bone point to this bearing. So now if I run the timeline, you can see how that bone sticks up here and stretches down here. If your bone was the other direction, then your child of target would be this, and your stretch to target would be the empty. So now it's just a matter of going around and adding the same constraints around. So child of, stretch to, child of the empty, and you want to stretch to the bearing. And I think it's a good idea as you put each one on just to make sure that everything moves properly. Another thing we want to do is while we're here, you want to select the geometry, shift select the armature, go into pose mode, select the bone, hit Control P, and then choose bone. And then when we move the timeline, that geometry moves with it. So as you go around, as you set your constraints, go back into pose mode, choose the bone, Control P, bone, and then just give it a quick test, make sure everything's moving, and then just keep going around the engine. All right, so all of our bones are now attached, and if I scrub through the timeline, it looks like everything is moving okay. I don't see anything popping out that's weird. Now, one thing I do want to fix is the parenting of this plate here. So let's go, you can see how it's separating it's not following. That's just because this plate hasn't been parented to that. So I'm just selecting the base plate, shift select the petal, control P, and then parenting to object. And that should fix that. So that looks good. And the one last thing is this actuator, this entire arm here is supposed to move forward and backwards when these petals move. Actually, that's actually what causes the petals to move in and out, is the forward and backward motion of this actuator arm. And that's fairly easy to do. We just need to parent this ring to this bone and then animate this bone. So select the bone, select this ring first, shift select the armature, go into pose mode, choose this bone, control P, choose bone. And now when we move this bone, that whole ring moves. And when the arms are, or when the petals are in this kind of closed position, it means that this actuator is supposed to be forward. So I'm going to move this bone forward a bit. Something like that. And we'll make that the initial position at frame 1. And that's along the bone's y-axis. So I just want to insert a keyframe here. Insert single keyframe. That'll be in the, I guess, the closed position. And then when we go to the end of the animation, I want to move that ring backwards. I'm going to hit GY on the actuator, or on this bone here, on the rod bone, and pull it back, and hit insert single keyframe there. And now when we run the simulation, we should see that actuator move back and forth, making it look like it's pushing all that stuff in and out. Just kind of check it from a couple different angles. Just make sure everything looks like it's working. All right, so far so good. It's probably a good time to mirror the armature to the right engine. So I'm going to hide some of this stuff, make it a little easier to see what we're doing here. Because the first thing I need to do is I need to make copies of the empties back here, these little empties, and put them on the other side of the axis, or other side of the y-axis. And I don't know of any way to actually officially quote-unquote mirror them like you would do geometry. So what I do is I Shift D, right click, and then I just put a negative sign in front, and then that'll move it over to that side. And I'm just going to go around and do that to each of these. Shift D, right click, negative, and that way I'll get an exact copy on the other side. All right, and now we have empties on the other side matching all these points here. And of course we need to parent these to this ring on the right hand side. We don't want them parented to the ring on the left. We want to override that parent. So I'm going to go around here, choose each of these. It's too much. And then choose the ring, control P, parent to object. And now when I move that, all those empties should move with it. And just to make sure nothing got carried over, I'm just going to scrub through here. And just at this point, nothing should be moving on the right-hand side. That's what I'm just checking for. Nothing's moving over there. And everything still seems to work on the left. In other words, I didn't mess anything up. And so now's a good time to mirror our armature to the other side. And we planned for this by creating an armature where the root bone was on the y-axis, with the origin of that bone on the y-axis, with the rotation and scale applied. And we also made all of the bones have a .L suffix on them so that Blender knew what to do with them. So anything that's .L is going to be moved over as a .R on the other side. So we want to go into edit mode, and we're going to select all the bones on the left side. I'm going to right click and say symmetrize, and it's going to move the bones over. It looks like it didn't move some over, but we can work around that. That's not a big deal. Now, one thing to note is that when the bones came over, they came over with all of the constraints and parenting that were on this side. So we're going to need to break that and then redo the constraints, because if we go into edit, or we go into pose mode now, it's going to look like spaghetti, because like these armature pieces are all pointing to their parents and children on the other side of the engine. So we're basically going to have to go through and just kind of clean this stuff up. But at least we got most of the bones over there. First thing I want to do here is just disable the constraints just because it's kind of a mess. It's hard to see. And then we'll reset these constraints later once we get some of the other stuff organized. But this should make it a little bit easier to see what's going on. And then once this is done, I'm going to have to recreate some of the bones that didn't get copied over. It looks like some of those hinge bones didn't make it. So if we look here, there's supposed to be hinge bones all the way around here. So what I think I'll do is I'll take our empty here. I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to move it over to the other side so we have a reference point for the right engine. Put the cursor right there. And now I can go select my armature. I'm going to select a bone and I want to rotate it. What am I missing here? I'm missing, we'll go just do one at a time. So I want to shift D to duplicate it, R -45. Because I'm in 3D cursor mode, I'm just orbiting around my cursor. Shift D, R -45. Shift D, R -45. Shift D, R negative. I think I did it right. R -45. All right, so now we've got our bones all the way around. I guess if we wanted to be neat about it, we could then go and rename them. All right, so now we've got our bones all the way around there. At this point, I'm just going to do the parenting that we did before. We've got these pins here that need to get parented to the petals as an object. And then the petal itself needs to be parented to the bone. So I just control shifted or shift selected on the armature. Now if I hit control P, I'm going to choose bone. And if we move it along the y-axis, all that stuff should move. And you can just hit Alt-R to move a bone back into its original position. So I'm just going to work my way around here doing that parenting. All right, so that is all the petal hinges done. So let's do these actuators next. So they already have our constraints on them, but we just need to redirect them. So I enable this, it's going to be pointing to the wrong thing. So the child, remember we want the child to be at the base and the stretch 2 to be the pointy bit. So we go back to our constraint. So the child is going to be, let me go back to sticks. So the child is going to be this empty here. So we want to get rid of this empty and we want to choose this empty. And if it skips off like that, try set inverse. That often puts it back. And then the stretch 2 is going to be pointing over to the left engine. We want to change that from there to here. And now if we rotate this, that works fine. And then we just want to, of course, parent this bit of geometry to that bone, Control P, and now if we move that, then that piece works just fine. So once again, I'm just going to work my way around here and reset these constraints. So that's it for the petals, and then of course the last thing we have to do is the rod. That's easy enough, so we're just going to select the ring of rods there, shift select the armature, make sure we got that bone selected, Control P, bone, and now all those rods move together. And then the next thing we do is we need to set the keyframes for these so that they match the types of keyframes for here. So I remember it's at 17 degrees here, and then whatever this distance was, I'll go look that up for that. So I'm just going to quick do that. All right, so I made it all the way around, and now if we scrub through our timeline, both engines open and close. So far so good. At this point we have an animation which is nice, but it's not overly useful because we can't, well, it only runs from frame 1 to 120, right? Ideally, we'd want to be able to run this animation at any point in time. And to do that, we're going to create little controllers or widgets, and then we're going to use the actions that were created when we created the keyframes to link those controllers to the different engines so we can control them independently and at any time we want to do it. Let's start by creating that widget that we want to use for the actual controller. So I'm just going to go to rear view here. I'm going to put my cursor right in the middle, go to medium point, Shift A, create a circle, change it to 24, S, GZ, just bring it straight down, go into edit mode, select everything, ES, to give myself some faces. I'm going to select top and bottom edge, Control B, just to bevel it a little bit. I'm going to select this one, and now I'm going to switch to individual origins, S2, scale it up. I'm going to hit this one and this one, S0 to scale them down, get rid of these faces here. Click the faces, and then just going to grab these inner ones here, back to medium point, SX0, all M, merge by distance. Now I've got a nice little widget we can use, graphic, that'll indicate opening and closing these. I do want to make sure that my origin is set. So we got median, and we want to say, get out there, Control A, rotation, set rotation and scale. And there we go. That's what I was looking for. I just want to show you the y-axis is pointing this way. All right, so let's duplicate this, and we're going to put one on the other side for the other engine. This one's going to, when we spin this one, it's going to control these feathers, and when we spin this one, it's going to control these feathers. So let's make sure our timeline is at the beginning and our petals are in the closed position. It's probably not a bad idea to name these, and we'll call this like left engine or left petals, and I like to turn on the name so that I can see it, and then call this one right petals, turn on the name, and then in your outliner it's probably a good idea also to turn off rendering because we never want to see them in the render. Okay, so we're going to use when we created the these armatures, I told you earlier on that it created an action as soon as we created our first keyframes. So we're now going to use this action and link it with these widgets so that we can control them. I'm just going to rename this one called petal action. And I want to create a fake user for it. The fake user prevents Blender from deleting this action data if we were to close the file and it's not used by anything. It's just Blender does a lot of cleanup of unnecessary stuff when it closes, and by assigning a fake user to something, you don't lose it. Right now, if we run the animation, you can see that our petals move. Now I'm going to delete the action. It still exists in our file. It's just not attached anymore to these bones. And if I do this, then nothing happens. So now we want to create action constraints between the bones and this controller. So we do that over here in the bone constraints. I'm going to pick an action, bring this up, and we're going to choose our controller. We want to rotate our controller along its y-axis in its local space. You want to use local space because this is going to be attached to the airplane. If the airplane's moving around and banking and stuff, you don't want that motion to affect the afterburners. You want only the local motion of this to control these bones. So that's why it's local space. I'm going to say 0 to 90, so we rotate it 90 degrees. It'll be from fully open to fully closed. We're going to choose the action, and we want it to run from frame 1 to 120. So I'm going to frame 1 to 120. Now if we go out here, and I'm just going to lock those so I can rotate it, and you see nothing happens. And what I found is that in order for this to actually work, this needs to be parented to something. Anything is fine. So I'm just going to shift the afterburner cans, Control P, and now if I rotate this, you can see that petal starts to move, right? So I don't know why that parenting thing is required, but it is. And now I can just simply copy those action constraints to the other hinges. So if I go and select all the other bones here around the left engine, and then finally the one that does have the action constraint on it, I can hit Control C, and then you want to do copy bone constraints, and you can see that it put in the bone constraints for us. And if we rotate this guy now, then all those petals open. We can do something similar on this side. I can take one of these bones, shift select to the left engine, Control C, copy bone constraints. Now it's going to be controlled by this guy now. We don't want that, so we need to redirect this bone to point to this. So we go under target. Actually, left pedal, we want to do this one, target this guy. And now we need to parent this to something in order for it to work. Right, and now if I rotate this guy, then that pedal works as well. And now it's just a matter of, let's select the armature, selecting all the other bones around this ring. Finally, the last bone that has the action on it, Control C, copy bone constraints. And now I can open and close these. I can open and close these. And the only other thing we got to really do is we need to do the rod control as well. So let's do that. We'll go into pose mode. We need to create an action constraint for this. Actually, we should be able to just copy it from this. Let me see. Copy bone constraint. Yeah, that worked. Not sure why I was thinking it wouldn't. So pose, select that one, Control C, copy bone constraints. And now when we rotate these guys, go into individual origins, both our engines open and close, and the rods move. Excellent. All right, and now the nice thing here is that we can keyframe these widgets anytime we want. So I could put a keyframe. I'm just gonna hit I here. I, right, and then maybe here, maybe just duplicate this one to there, and then I'm going to go 90 and keyframe that, duplicate it, and then if we run the animation, see, things automatically happen, and we can have them open and close at any time we want. So that's the cool thing about those widgets is the keyframing aspect of them. So we have full control. One other thing you might want to talk about or think about is adding constraints to these to keep them from rotating too far. Because right now, if I rotate this, you can see if you're looking up here, I can go well beyond 0 and 90. We don't want to do that. And that's easily done by creating an object constraint. So we want to go to object constraints, and we want to limit rotation. Going to limit all of them. Y we're going to allow to go from 0 to 90. And I'm going to, if you watch up here, if I spin this, you can see that the arrows are only going 0 to 90, but that number up there is going outside the 0 to 90 range. In order to stop that from happening, just click on this effect transform, and now when I 0 to 90, that's the full range. It doesn't go outside of that. And we just do the same thing for this guy. We add a limit rotation, everything 90, effect transform, and this guy locks in also. All right, that I think is it for the tutorial. I hope that was helpful. If you have questions, leave them below. I'll try to answer them. Good luck with your projects, and thank you for watching.